What's up, everyone? All right. Let me make sure all this is working properly. So first thing I'll do is wait for all of you to tell me if you can hear my voice because I'm using my laptop. Normally I use my iPhone, but in this case I'm using my laptop. That way I can see all of your comments very easily. And so there you go. So I'll wait for one of you to say in the chat if you can hear me. I always find it funny how jazz musicians, there's always that little triplet figure, you know, and it's just like everyone talks about the lick, but that awesome. You guys can't hear me, but that little thing is just used so frequently. It always cracks me up every time that I hear it, but it does sound nice, of course. Cool, sweet, awesome. So I think let's do questions first. I'm planning on going until 5, which is about 2 hours. Although I might go a little longer because I do have quite a bit of energy today. So, yeah. So I guess I'll just, you know what I'll do? Actually, I'll play something on the piano just for fun. Hopefully the audio isn't terrible. I'll let some people join and then go ahead and start asking questions and I'll get to them. We'll do a little improvisation. I have nothing planned. So forgive mistakes and noodling. These are Bach's chorales. All right. There you go. Good enough. Messy. All right. So I'm going to go through all these questions one by one. Thank all of you for showing up. Already 24. Amazing. Thank you for the the clap emoji. When is the next Logic production stream? That's a great question. So I do want to make a lot of more videos about Logic, but the thing is, most of what my current work is doing, or most of the current work that I'm doing is generally composition, orchestration, writing educational materials. I do use Logic every now and then, but a lot of my sampling, as a lot of you know, I kind of delegate to Brett Ensley and I go to his studio and record because I don't really have a lot of amazing samples. I'm not really kind of like a tech guy as far as that stuff is concerned. Now, that being said, I'm probably going to, at some point in my life, probably soon, really get into the samples and the synthesizers and things like that. But in any case, I have been interested in doing fun little video series about writing music with the built-in Logic sounds, right? Because I think it's super fun. I think one of the problems with DAWs is that people often get the sense that they need to buy a lot of expensive plugins and sample libraries in order to be able to get a good musical sound, right? And there's a composer whom I love, Oscar Garvin. I've probably mentioned him before. Check him out on SoundCloud if you haven't. Check out like Catmouth Island, for example. He has a lot of fantastic music, just like really, high production value music. And he oftentimes, especially for his older stuff, just uses the built-in Logic sounds. I also actually love the GarageBand app for the iPhone. And so I'd also love to do if I can figure out a way to record it, I'd love to do a series writing music on the iPhone with GarageBand, even just not even plugging in, an external keyboard, but just on the phone. I think that would be super fun. But as far as like videos about like sampling and mixing and mastering stuff, that's really kind of outside of my area of expertise. I know enough about it to get by with my own music, but I don't foresee that I'll be doing a lot of stuff that's heavily DAW oriented, kind of in that sense. So hope that answers. All right. And I'll go ahead and make sure and read these questions out loud. So that question was, when is the next Logic production screen? So are you going to release track stems for remixes? Do you mean, am I going to release like projects or stems for music that I've written? I haven't done a lot of remixes in the traditional sense, so I'm not sure what you mean by that. So maybe you can clarify. Do you recommend learning improvisation? So Matt F asks, do you recommend learning improvisation / jazz and classical at the same time, or maybe a few years of classical under your belt first? Not sure how different the technique is between the two. Okay, so as far as, well, they're different. Let's talk about performance. We'll talk about composition. We'll talk about, really, we can just split it into kind of those two. So as far as performance is concerned, there is some differentiation that needs to be made. And this sometimes depends upon the instrument itself. Like, for example, if you're a saxophonist, jazz saxophone has a completely different embouchure and often reed setup and kind of technique, and also a series of articulations and ways of interpreting articulations, such as like what jazz players call housetop accents, which is really just like a traditional marcato marking in the classical sense. So in the case of like the saxophone, for example, you would actually have to kind of learn two different, and Matt Olson, who is the professor of saxophone, brilliant saxophonist at Furman University, he's a rare example of someone who plays classical and jazz saxophone. Most people tend to only do one or the other because they are kind of different. And then if we're talking about general kind of idiomaticisms, like for example, swing, right? Swing is something that is kind of a very intuitive kind of abstract way of feeling rhythm. It's not quite triplet. It's not quite straight. It's really difficult to kind of pin down because it depends upon the tempo. Things get straighter the faster they are, and they tend to be heavier. And it also depends upon like the subgenre of jazz if you're trying to be accurate to a particular time period. But I personally, I do both. I don't know if that's stupid or not, but I try and do both. And so I do think that they complement each other very nicely. With jazz, you're going to be focusing on theory and improvisation and really kind of understanding a theoretical framework of what you're playing. And also improvisation really helps you think about music in a more kind of connected way as opposed to just playing these notes on the page. But the same is true in reverse. Jazz players, for example, oftentimes, especially pianists, their left hands tend to be a little bit weaker because they don't use them as often. And although, of course, really great jazz musicians often will play classical music. Like there's a great example, I think Chick Corea and Keith Jarrett, if I remember correctly, although I could be wrong, did like a double concerto or something where they performed like Mozart's piano concerto. And so there are a lot of jazz pianists, and Oscar Peterson was classically trained. And so I definitely think that they're very complementary. Classical is going to give you a focus on theoretical technique. It's going to give you good sight reading abilities, which are or aren't useful depending upon what you're going into. I don't think anyone needs to be really good at sight reading. I suck at sight reading. I've been trying to get better at it by reading chorales and things like that. But it's also like, for me, sight reading becomes much easier if I've heard the piece of music ahead of time, right? So if I'm reading, like, let's say Beethoven's, I don't know, a Beethoven sonata movement that I've heard before, but I've never seen the sheet music before, it's much easier because the notation essentially just fills in the details of what my ear already knows, right? But as far as reading something that I've never heard before, I'm an awful sight reader. But that isn't necessarily a mandatory skill unless you are a rehearsal accompanist, or unless you want to be able to just pull out things and perform them easily. I still think you can kind of slowly go through and read things, even if you're not a great sight reader, and learn from them. But anyway, I'm kind of getting off track here. But yeah, so I do definitely think that they are complementary. I would personally go for jazz first and then classical, right? You could learn them in tandem, right? I mean, it depends upon to what degree you want to focus on one or the other. Like if you're learning jazz piano, you still could be learning to read sheet music simultaneously. And jazz pianists don't as often have as hardcore a kind of technical understanding of the specific kind of ways of proper piano technique and fingering and things like that. But the reality is, if you get a really high level, like great jazz piano teacher or classical piano teacher, they're both going to have an equal amount of focus on technique. It's just that one is going to be focused on improvisation and theory, whereas the other is going to be focused on sight reading and also the interpretation of classical works. With jazz, you're encouraged to be kind of more original and to develop your own sound. But at the same time, if you're taking from like a classical piano teacher, there might be a little bit more focus on staying true to the original composer in a particular time period and phraseology. So anyway, bottom line is I think they're complementary. I don't think that you have to learn one before the other. I think they both can be learned in tandem. It's just a matter of like, obviously have to recognize that that's going to take time. And so you have to be willing to make the time. And I can't tell you that I would recommend one over the other unless I knew exactly like what your entire life story is and what you want out of your life. So that doesn't really answer that question specifically, but at the same time, I think it's, open-ended. Do you ever plan on Spotifying your YouTube compositions? Perhaps. I don't know a lot about how all of that stuff. I've heard really everyone is always telling me terrible things about Spotify and iTunes and how they pay the musicians and things like that. And while I'm not that concerned with payment for myself, I would not be interested in supporting a platform if they don't treat musicians well. But then again, I haven't thoroughly researched it, so I don't know. So I would just say I don't know. If it's something, the only reason that I wouldn't eventually put my stuff on Spotify is if I do some research and find that there's something that I find personally, morally, reprehensible about what they're doing. But I don't know enough to be able to answer that question. I've only heard over the grapevine. Thanks, Matt, first. Yeah. So what synth software do you have? And will you do a stream playing preset synths? Yeah. So, I mean, the interesting thing with synthesizers is, I mean, I mess around with synthesizers all the time and I write a lot of music with synthesizers, but honestly, I just kind of move knobs around and I don't have a precise technical understanding like I do with some other kind of more classical acoustic kind of music. I don't have that with synthesizers. I really just mess around with knobs, and I know like low frequency oscillators and attack, sustain, decay, and release, and basic waveforms and things like that. But again, not my area of expertise, but I definitely would love to do, I mean, usually I just use like built-in synth generators. And the thing is, because synths are essentially just completely digital and not trying to actually emulate some real players and aren't recorded from real players, most built-in synth generators in DAWs nowadays are all fantastic. I mean, certainly way better than the synths from the 70s and 80s and 90s and early 2000s. So, as opposed to like sample libraries where the built-in sample libraries of most DAWs are not nearly as good as ones that you can buy because of the extra cost that it requires to record live musicians. But usually I just use Omnisphere as a supplementary. That's pretty much the only synth kind of extra library that I own. But a lot of the synth stuff that you hear on my SoundCloud and YouTube channel is just Logic built-in preset stuff. And I usually don't like to use presets unless it's like a really, really awesome sound. I'll usually use a preset as a starting point, sometimes even just like a basic waveform as a starting point, but more often like a preset as a starting point, and then essentially just modify it until I get something that I want. I also like to layer things together, and that's something that's very easy to do with Logic. You know, if you find one kind of waveform and another kind of waveform that are kind of complementary, you can couple them together so that you have a single synth built out of those different things. And then, of course, you can add other effects like reverberation and bit crusher and things like that. So as far as all that basic stuff is concerned, yeah, I'd love to do a video on that. Although, again, I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination as far as that is concerned. Just kind of having fun with those kinds of things. Sorry if this is weird, but are you a patron to Cosmic Skeptic? I saw your name on his stuff, and I was wondering whether it was a coincidence or not. Yeah, no, I am a patron to Cosmic Skeptic. I love his YouTube videos. I love his stuff. He's a great orator, a great debater, and he's also very he's very polite, you know, and as opposed to some of the other kind of similar kind, like, for example, like Richard Dawkins can often be very impolite. And well, we'll save that whole, you know, that's kind of outside of music, but in any case, yeah, no, I'm a huge fan of him, and I'm kind of I listen to a lot of science, but like Lex Friedman's podcast, I love. Sean Carroll has a great podcast called Mindscape, which I love. I listen to a lot of Joe Rogan, so that's kind of a whole non-musical world, but yeah, so I do follow a lot of those people, and Cosmic Skeptic is someone that I am following on Patreon, in particular because I wanted to have a chat with him on Skype, which is super fun. So let's see. I don't have perfect pitch and I'm depressed. Am I being stupid? You're not being stupid, but you definitely shouldn't be depressed because I don't have perfect pitch. You know, like for let me see if I can guess. This will show you how long it takes me, and even if I can. I feel like that's C. I could be wrong. No. That's not high enough to be D though. And see, it's funny if I do like D and then I go like I'm about to play the note D, do. So maybe it's C. So it was a little bit flat, right? So I thought it was D. I was wrong. And then the moment I went to the piano, my muscle memory kicked in and my ear was like, oh, when you play that note, you're going to hear that. And I was kind of right, but then a little bit flat, right? So like that's the best you can do if you have relative pitch. There's really nothing more that you can do than that. But perfect pitch is not necessary. I don't think at all. It's certainly a helpful kind of little boost, but having relative pitch is much more important. And I've kind of talked about this before, but I'll kind of reiterate a story of a student. So I was a theory TA at Furman University under Dr. Koppelman, Daniel Koppelman's class, which was super fun. He's a great professor. But anyway, there was a student, obviously I won't say names, in there who had perfect pitch and did not develop relative pitch. Now, people often assume that if you have perfect pitch, it means automatically you have relative pitch. It's just sort of like a higher level, but they are different things. So, for example, he would hear, and this is just so strange to me as a relative pitch person, but it's very, very interesting. Someone would play like a major seventh chord, do, 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 da, right? And he would think to himself, it would take him a second. If someone played that and just said, hey, what quality of chord this is? Anyone with good relative pitch would be able to just listen to it and kind of just recognize the emotional content of it, and they've mapped that onto the label major seventh, and they can just say major seventh instant, just like you can look at that wall and be like, oh, you know, manila, green, red, you know, you don't even have to think about it, right? It's just mapping the conscious experience of it onto a particular word, right? But he would go through each note, you know, C, okay, that's a C, that's an E, that's a G, that's a B, and then he'd count it up. Okay, so it's a major it's a major seventh, and he would get all the right answers on all the tests, but he didn't have that kind of instantaneous perception of quality of, like, for example, harmonic sonorities, which is something that people with relative pitch can develop. So if you have perfect pitch, it's still important to have relative pitch. And if you don't have perfect pitch and you have relative pitch, you're in good company. I mean, Stravinsky purportedly have relative pitch. I mean, you can name all kinds of famous composers who have relative pitch and lots of famous composers who do have perfect pitch. So I think it's more of a party trick than anything else, right? And to look at someone like Jacob Collier, right? I mean, he takes perfect pitch to an absurd level. I mean, the dude can like hear an AC sound and figure out exactly what the hertz is. That's Jacob Collier, right? That's the one and only, which is amazing and wonderful. But, you know, there's no reason for anyone to be upset at themselves for not having that kind of ability, because it's just kind of a fun supplementary thing. But it's not at all necessary to compose good music, be fluent, to have a good ear, to be able to understand what's happening theoretically when you're listening to a piece of music. Because think about it. I mean, like a harmonic progression, if I played something like, you know, you know, something like that. Like you could, anyone with good relative pitch could listen to that. Anyone could develop themselves to the point that they could hear that and hear that it's a 2-5-1, right? And yada 9, right? The ninth of the chord going to the third, going up to the ninth again. You could write out, with numbers, or you have an idea of like, that's what solfege is, right? Solfege is like relative pitch, right? So you can hear do, re, mi, fa, sol, do, re, mi, fa, sol, do, re, mi, fa, sol. You can relatively hear the patterns of what you're playing, and that's really what's most important, because really there's not a difference between C minor and C sharp minor and D minor and E flat minor, except that some instruments play easier on those than the other. Some people have synesthesia and hear those keys as being brighter than the other, but with regards to 12-tone equal temperament, they're all the exact same. They're just slightly shifted, but there's no difference in coloration. That may have been the case back when we had different tuning systems. And I think Early Music Sources, if I remember the name of the channel, did a fantastic video on temperaments that I recommend people would check out. But in any case, yeah, I don't think you should at all be depressed that you don't have perfect pitch. I'm not depressed, and I don't have that I don't have perfect pitch at all. I've never encountered a situation where I wished that I had it, and I've never, beyond just like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if I had perfect pitch? It can, but like that's just so shallow. Anyway, okay. Moving forward, jazz theory shows you what sounds good. Classical theory tells you why. I wouldn't agree with that. That's kind of a simplification. I think they both show you what sounds good and why. They just make different sounds. Spotify uploading is really confusing. Interesting. Bandcamp is probably the best. I have heard a lot about Bandcamp. An Omnisphere stream would be awesome. I would enjoy that. Thanks. Oh, yeah. And by the way, thank you all so much for 20,000 subscribers. Again, I can't believe that it's been slowly climbing to 20K, even though I haven't posted any YouTube videos in a while. And I have tons of ideas for YouTube. That's my biggest problem, is I just have so many ideas that to like pick some and commit to them is very, very difficult. But for any of you who fear that I'll be abandoning my YouTube channel at any point, that's not going to be the case. I promise you. I'm going to finish the How to Write Fantasy. I've got a bunch of score reviews to go through. I still have to finish the melody competition and do the orchestration for that. And I also have a bunch of ideas for new video series. And I'm thinking about doing some kind of like not crowdsourcing, but what's the word that I'm looking for? I'm thinking about putting some sort of public document of what all of my ideas are for my channel, and then allowing all of you to kind of vote on what you think is the most important, and then maybe either give a slightly higher vote weight to the patrons, or maybe not. Maybe it might be a better idea to give patrons like every fifth video that I make is a patron request, whereas the other 4 videos are from the general public. Any ideas that you all have would be great. And by the way, if you have any ideas about anything, about my channel, about things that I should do, advice, anything like that, I love all that stuff and I read it. So just, feel free to send me emails, and also contact me on my Discord server, right? I haven't been super active there in terms of like posting things, but I do read the things that you all say. So if you say something on the Discord server, even if I don't end up responding, and maybe I should do like a little heart icon or something, just to let you all know that I do actually respond to it. But anyway, hey, Richard. Okay, so does transcribing music help you become a better composer? And if so, how can you really get the most out of it? I definitely think it does, and there are a lot of different reasons to transcribe music. So one, it definitely, you're basically, there are a lot of different ways to perceive the world just in general in terms of like sensory data. And with music, this is no exception, right? So if you are, I would say just like read music, listen to music, transcribe music just from listening to it, right? And the thing is, with regards to like training your ear, having an idea of being able to recognize harmonic sonorities vertically, having an idea of being able to recognize contours of pitches, and relatively to be able to write them out. Rhythmic dictation, so that's harmonic, melodic, and rhythmic dictation. Also textural dictation, right? Can you tell the difference between, subtly different, like this mute on a trumpet as opposed to this mute, or even this same instrument but 2 different players? Or even hearing, like if you're a mixing and mastering engineer, you need to be able to hear the attenuation of a room and how large it is and whether or not you have like little, little like my kitchen in there. If you go into my kitchen and slab, there's so many 90-degree angles that you can hear this, right? This kind of little repetitive thing. So there are a lot of different aspects to just ear training in general. As far as transcription is concerned, jazz players obviously do transcription all the time. And this is for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, it's primarily a kind of non-classical. Jazz kind of developed its own originality because a lot of those players did not really come from a classical kind of era or a classical background, so to speak. And a lot of them didn't know how to read sheet music. And this was, of course, possibly a bad thing, but also a good thing because it means that, players would listen to the way that they would teach the real book that we have nowadays, which lists all the sort of jazz standards, is really a secondary artifact that Berkeley, ended up releasing, kind of later on, and they were just transcribing tunes from records and things. But back in the kind of golden age of jazz, people would just write a new tune, they'd have it in their head, and they wouldn't even write it down except maybe just the basic framework of the melody, and they'd play it for their bandmates in the recording session. They'd listen to it, they'd pick it up, and they'd play. And so I think this is kind of organicism and kinetic connection that one can have to the music when one engages one ear, but at the same time, having sheet music, in a kind of more discrete, discursive way of thinking about music can also be very helpful to organize all of those things and allow you to see patterns that you wouldn't see if you were just thinking intuitively. So I think both are very, very important. So yeah, I do think transcribing music would help you become a better composer. And as far as getting the most out of it, that's a really open-ended question. I don't really know how to answer that as much as just like, transcribe different aspects of the music. Like, it doesn't have to be super specific if you're just starting out, right? Like, for example, if you're listening to like just a score, first thing that you do, if you hear a particular, like, let's say 16-bar section, you can focus on that and go in high levels of detail. Or also you can just listen to a piece of music and just write down what you're hearing in terms of like a story or drama that's unfolding, in terms of recurring thematic material. And then you could get to the level of like specific motives, and then you could double check what you wrote against the score. As far as specifically training melodic, rhythmic, and harmonic dictation with regards to transcription, I think it's very important to check what you've written against the actual thing. So if you immediately look at the score and know what it is, you're kind of spoon feeding and babying yourself, which is of course fine if your goal is not to train your ear. But if your goal is to train your ear, listen to something, transcribe it, listen to it, and then triumph it. And then worst case scenario, if you really can't figure it out, then you look at the score, and don't just look at the score and correct what you did, but notice specifically what kind of thing that you messed up. Did you mistake the rhythm from, right? Because that's like a classic example of like a very common misconception with regards to rhythm, right? If I'm going like, right, that's like dotted eighth, dotted eighth, eighth, butted, but which is different, right? Which is different than like a triplet, but it's a very similar rhythmic thing. Bum, 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 as opposed to bum, bum, bum. Very subtle difference, right? But if you do a transcription where a bunch of those dotted rhythms appear, a bunch of triplets appear, and you find that you're mismatching, you can use that to teach yourself, right? Think about it. If you were a professor teaching yourself, you would think, okay, this student is commonly making this mistake. I'm noticing that, so I'm going to give him specific exercises to help work on that, right? It's not just like you're generally kind of mindlessly practicing, right? It goes back to the whole, practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. And really, it's not perfect. It's just like, conscious, careful, paying attention. Make yourself objective, like think about yourself as if you were teaching yourself, right? Don't be identified inside of the confines of your own mind every second of the way. Sometimes you can take a step back and sort of look at what you did and not at all get upset that you didn't do it, or even triumphant that you would just kind of think of it totally objectively and just think, okay, I made these mistakes. What kind of mistakes do I commonly make? Are there any correlations and similarities? And how can I use that to cater your own training program to specifically work on those particular things that you have difficulty with? Because different people learning have different difficulties with different kinds of things, even in the context of like melodic dictation, right? Someone might have a very easy telling the difference between like major and minor, but a difficulty telling the difference between like a diminished chord and an augmented chord, right? And that may be just a matter of familiarity with the sound, but it also may be a matter of some presupposition that they have, and that's the other thing too. You can kind of determine to what level you're being logical about it, or intuitive about it. And again, I think they're both important. If your intuition runs a blank, then you may be able to deduce it logically with the information that you have. And at the same time, even if you can get something correct by deducing it, it's always faster to eventually turn it into an intuition, right? It's like when you're learning to drive a car, anything, or this goes back to Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2, which is a great book, by the way, which I'm sure I've mentioned before. Anyway, okay, next question. Sorry if somebody says this already, but what other musical genres have you tried arranging, composing, and besides classical and jazz? Well, the thing is, there's kind of two kinds of composition. There's like being a chameleon, writing pastiche, right? And then there's also writing your own original music, right? But when you write your own original music, if you try to be original, you can't really be original. You just kind of have to experiment with ideas that are of interest to you. And because you are a unique human being to a great degree, in addition to also being similar to other people, if you just kind of naturally follow your own impulses, not necessarily worrying so much about whether other people approve or disapprove of them, just kind of following your own heart, so to speak, you can develop your own style. But at the same time, if you want to be a media composer, which I do for whatever reason, write music for games, films, things like that, then you do need to have an understanding of other people's perception of music and what the common conventions are and what your project you're working on and so on and so forth. So, But just to answer the question specifically, I've experimented with some world music. I've listened to some classical Indian music, although I don't know a lot about it. North African music. I had a great world music class where we had a professor, Julie Moore, who had lived in North Africa for a long period of time in multiple parts of Africa, and she was really familiar with and had all these exotic instruments of the particular traditions, which are actually very sophisticated polyrhythmic traditions in Africa, and of course traditional classical Japanese music and things like that. So I've experimented with a lot of different genres, chiptune, 8-bit music, if you can call that a genre. You can go kind of check it out on my SoundCloud. But I would say kind of the primary genres that I tend to find myself kind of coming back to are sort of like my own style, whatever on earth that is. If I even have remotely my own style, it would be presumptuous of me to say that. But writing music where I'm not concerned with trying to follow a style. Obviously classical, right? Because you have a classical music education. I do love classical music, and also classical is a big giant. It's like you got the Renaissance, you've got the Baroque, you've got classical, you've got kind of the transitional classical period between classical and romantic, which like Beethoven would be the prime representative of. And then once you get into kind of, a little bit later, then you've got, of course, French Impressionism. I love French Impressionism. That's a huge, I also love minimalism. I've written a little bit of minimalism, but I listen to a lot of minimalism. Steve Reich, Arvo Pärt, John Adams, Terry Riley. A lot of that stuff I find to be very, very compelling and interesting. Slow, gradual changes over time, and process music, which inspired a lot of the harmonic things that I do, especially in my later music that I've written recently. Harmonic processes kind of governed by emotional correlations and things. But that's a story for another time. But anyway, but yeah, I'm interested in a lot of different genres, and even rap. I've been listening to a lot of 90s rap recently that my little brother Elijah has introduced me to, and Eminem and stuff too. I've really enjoyed listening to Eminem and stuff, and both musically and in terms of the lyrics, right? Because it is kind of a form of minimalism, right? And yeah, so a lot of different genres. I'm not really that kind of, even bluegrass music. I used to go and visit my grandma in the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina, because she has a house up there, and I used to go visit her, and we would always go to authentic bluegrass, and I love banjo and bluegrass and all that stuff. So I'm a very, for whatever reason, we'll just say maybe it's temperament, just kind of the personality I was born with, or maybe it's something that I specifically aimed for. I don't really know. I can't psychoanalyze myself in that way, but I have not encountered a genre of music yet that I just hate the entire genre, right? Even country music, even just like John Denver. I love John Denver, right? I love classic rock. I love progressive rock. I love Rush. I love Styx. I love Police. I love dubstep, especially really cool dubstep and glitch step and stuff. I love chill step. All kinds of musical genres. Okay, continuing forward. I got to keep track of the questions. Let's see. I can only identify B flat because of the Star Wars theme. I used to do that as well, but not anymore. Grad school recommendations for composition. Unfortunately, I cannot recommend that because I did not go to grad school, and I'm not really planning on going to grad school, although I might later in life. But if I would probably, I think if I do end up going to grad school, it'll probably be for something other than music. Not that, I mean, music is always going to be my main and primary thing, but I'd love to like get a degree in philosophy. I'd love to get a degree in like the history of science. I'd love to get a degree in, there are several, and also literature. I love literature. So if I do end up going to grad school or even getting an additional education, it'll probably be later in my life for something other than music. But as far as music grad school is concerned, I don't really have any plans to go there immediately, and so I haven't done a lot of research. If you want to know why I am particular, it's not that I'm recommending against grad school by any stretch of the imagination. It's a very personal decision that depends upon the constituents of each individual's life. But if you're interested in knowing why I am not going to grad school, which is a different question than what you'd asked, feel free to ask and I'll answer that. But otherwise, I can just say that I unfortunately cannot answer that because I don't have any data. I can identify B because of the Hebwoods theme from Harry Potter. Yeah, that's a good one. Have you studied Bach's Passions and do you find them interesting? I haven't studied them as intensely as some of his other works. I tend to kind of listen to the entire catalog of a composer, and but at the same time, I tend to then kind of pick favorite pieces and really focus on those. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. The A minor violin concerto of Bach, the double violin concerto, the Goldberg variations, the well-tempered clavier, a lot of his Brandenburg concertos, and the B minor mass I'm very, very familiar with. I've listened to his passions and I do find them very interesting, and I find them very compelling from a narrative perspective, and emotional and beautiful. And it's really interesting to see a composer who primarily writes kind of absolute music, although not always, right? But a lot of let me rephrase. Most of the music that Bach has composed that I'm really familiar with is his absolute music, like the fugues and preludes from the Well-Tempered Clavier. They're not connected to any story. So it's really interesting to see such a rigorous composer and also creative composer apply those skills to in a religious context and for these kinds of ancient stories that are very, very beautiful. So, but in any case, many people pay attention only to his keyboard works. Guilty as charged. But no, I love his A minor violin concerto and his double concerto, especially the A minor violin concerto. The first movement is great, and the second movement is just beautiful, and the third movement is like I love how he like jumps up to like the leading tone and then resolves like on the like it's so cheeky. It's I'd love to do a video on this sometime. Do you think harmonic relativity and neo-Riemannian theory are related to each other? Slightly, yeah, although there's not really a clear idea of what harmonic relativity is. I mean, I've developed the theory a lot outside of videos. There are a lot of harmonic ideas. I mean, I feel like the video that I originally put on YouTube of just the basic kind of harmonic relationships, especially not even talking about how they relate to each other in terms of pitch collections or shapes or set theory, or, you know, where interval cycles are derived from and how, you know, geometric patterns can result on, the circle of fifths, or a kind of different interval cycles you can create. Some of that stuff crops up a little bit in the part writing book, as those of you who have the unfinished version have seen. But yeah, so I'm going to be doing a lot of more. But the thing is, harmony is really complicated. It's like complicated in the qualitative sense. Counterpoint is quantitatively complicated, right? There's just a lot of crap that you have to keep going on in your head to figure out how to write good counterpoint. But the rules, whether or not it's your own framework or a classical or Baroque or Renaissance framework of a kind of contrapuntal system, it's kind of quantitatively complex, but the rules are pretty simple, right? But harmony is very subtle and abstract and has many layers of kind of stratified things working together. And I've also been experimenting a lot with process harmony. So I'm definitely going to write a book on harmonic relativity. I'm going to do videos, but those are probably going to come later because I still have a lot of thinking and experimentation and composition. I don't feel comfortable enough with the kind of full scope of these ideas to kind of and I also need to do a lot of additional reading. My problem is often that I focus so much on kind of my own ideas and not read enough kind of, for example, academic theoretical literature. That's something that I'm planning on doing more, and I've been doing quite a bit recently, and I've found that I've enjoyed quite a bit. And I've also been learning a little bit of getting more comfortable with mathematics. I got a friend of mine who's a mathematician in grad school, and he's been helping me out with that. And so I feel like I have a lot more learning as far as all that is concerned, a lot of more self-education that I need to do before I feel comfortable kind of promulgating those theories, so to speak. And yeah, and I guess there is an advantage of kind of working on your own stuff because then you have a higher chance of being original. But at the same time, you might make, stupid errors, as I make all the time, that I wouldn't have made if I had read it externally from a source. So I think it's a kind of balance of both, finding that balance. And I certainly need to read more academic literature as far as theory is concerned. Okay. Hey man, forms, difficulty to compose them, easiest, hardest. Okay, so this is funny because I really don't ever compose in like sonata form, rondo form. I personally, and this is very personal, this is totally subjective, I really don't like the idea of choosing and writing an existing form. It's certainly a fun thing to do, but it's like, why would I not just cater make the formal structure of the piece exactly to what I want it to be? If I'm writing a pastiche, of course, I'm going to use sonata form or rondo form or whatever, but like 99.9% of my music, if it bears any formal resemblance to an existing form, which oftentimes they do, like introducing a primary theme and a secondary theme. But I do think it's useful to study these kinds of forms if you abstract out of them principles. So for example, like the idea of like coming in with a clear melodic statement as opposed to sneaking in. So if you check out, for example, like Beethoven's, I'm sure you all know the rondo from the Antique. I haven't even played it in a long time. You know that. There's a couple of moments in that, one, I mean, sometimes he'll go like, or whatever it is. Right? Big punctuation, which is different from another moment in the piece, which I can't play because I haven't played that since college, but he's like, he just sneaks into it. So that's like a simple idea. I can commit to introducing an idea, or I can sneak it in, right? But maybe something kind of in the middle is a little bit non-committal, right? And or like if you're studying, like, for example, sonata form, the idea of like presenting two individual themes that are contrasting and then combining them together and then differentiating, disentangling them at the end is something that you can follow without having to have the secondary theme and the dominant. Or maybe you could have three themes instead of two, right? Or maybe you don't have to have a transition between them. Or, and of course, even if you just listen to like Beethoven, right? But okay, so there's another point, though, that I should make, which is that if you start with an existing form and your listener is familiar with that form, you can then violate that pre-existing expectation. So if you're not using an existing form, you have to set up an expectation manually and then kind of override it. And so if you listen to something like Beethoven's Waldstein Sonata, the only reason that E major, going to a particular key as opposed to another key sounds, or at least one of the primary reasons why it sounds so striking is because people were so familiar with the conventions of the time that they expected it to do, they had a preconceived expectation. I personally don't like when people listen to my music that they have preconceived expectations as much. I like to kind of build a kind of new sound world, but that's a totally subjective thing. If you start with pre-existing, like in jazz, there's a really nice balance of both. That's one of the things that I love about jazz. People have pre-existing expectations because they've heard these standards before. They know the harmonic progressions. They've probably heard other people performing these, but at the same time, they expect you and encourage you and applaud you if you are creative with those things, but at the same time, still don't completely abandon the tradition. And so I find that jazz is a really nice balance between the two of them. But I don't write in specific, kinds of classical forms, cookie cutter forms, to put it pejoratively, often enough for me to be able to tell you what I think is more or less difficult to write in, because I just personally don't think that way pretty much ever when I write music. I do sometimes write in like common formal setups that I've kind of discovered that work well and are common in like film and video game music. And if you're writing like a 2-minute piece of music, especially, like I've written so many 2-minute pieces of music that I'm much more comfortable writing 2 minutes pieces of music than like 30-minute pieces of music, right? And so part of it just, and also endings, this is kind of a really funny formal thing. I'm not that good at writing endings because I've written so much looping game music that doesn't have endings. And so in a funny way, I just don't have a lot of experience writing endings, right? So part of it is just experimenting. And so I would recommend that you certainly study all these forms, practice writing inside of them, totally useful. Make sure that you're abstracting principles, like why is sonata form the way that it was? Why did sonata form come about? It really came from binary form, right? And what are the basic formal ideas ideas. Okay, contrast, right? You know, how much material do you have in a piece of music? You know, do you have too much material so that way people can't ever really keep track of any of the ideas, or too little material such that it gets dull, right? Is this section long enough before moving on to the next section? Well, maybe it sounds too short. And that's the other interesting thing about form. Maybe a decision that you make seems to be dissatisfying in the moment, but then in the larger scale tends to build. So for example, you know, just the other day I was teaching one of my students, and having a conversation about one of his pieces that he had written. And immediately when I listened to it, not having heard it before, there was this moment of climax, and it was kind of like, I was like, oh yes, let's climax. And then immediately it kind of didn't really go for it. And I kind of, initially I thought, you know, I wish it was a little bit, I feel like he needs to, I'm going to tell him that, you know, it should be a little bit, maybe it should be a little bit more. But then I listened to it, and he did a second climax, and then built into more, and then a third one, and then a fourth. And then suddenly I was like, oh, okay, I get it. I understand. And then it didn't bother me at all in retrospect, right? So sometimes you can have a little bit of pain, you know, I get I'm hungry, but it makes food taste better, right? And so finding that balance and how much you're willing to kind of, you know, build up tension with your audience, and kind of, you know, and of course Wagner with like Tristan and Isolde and the Ring Cycle, you know, is like the maximum expansion of that in terms of like romanticism, building up tension and releasing it. Also like jazz, you know, going out of keys, but, you know, going off of the rhythmic grid, playing hemiolas, and then coming back on, you know, kind of, you know, like skiing, you know, weightlessness, and then kind of order and chaos, yin and yang. It all really comes back down to that. But anyway, okay, I'm 15 years old. Zach says, I'm 15 years old, and I am considering a career in game film composition. I have some compositions on my channel. Should I promote them now or wait till I'm older to promote my music for freelancing? I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with you promoting your music now, because at the very least, I have no idea what the state of your music is. I mean, that's another thing too. People will sometimes come to me and be really self-deprecatory, but it's like, from my perspective, they're like amazing. And then there are other people who have you know, some more work before they get to a kind of level where they can charge a large amount of money for, you know, writing music, at least from the perspective of technical. You know, it's obviously subjective to say that you like or dislike someone's music, and I really try to not say that to my students, but just talk more about the technical things unless they ask for my subjective opinion. But anyway, where was I going with that? Oh yeah. So I would go ahead, and if you enjoy the music that you're writing, you know, I would go ahead and quote unquote promote it if you feel like you're interested in writing music for games and films. I wrote music for some games for free, and even though the games didn't turn out great, the process of working with a video game developer, talking about music implementation, I started doing that when I was like 12, 13 years old, and the music that I wrote at the time was not good music, you know, at all. And I'm sure your music is better than mine was at that age. So I would say, as long as you don't feel like you're being pressured to do it, as long as you're doing it because you're like, I want to promote my music because I want to write some music for some games. And yeah, so I would just say don't worry so much about charging. I know this is like, you know, you definitely want to charge what you're worth, and you definitely want to, I'm not saying write music for free forever, but at the very beginning, it's perfectly fine to write music for free for smaller level projects, especially if they don't have a budget and they're just like a developer. You can go on video game developer forums and things like that, make friends with the developers, and just like, you know, write music for them. And that experience will help you get better at the process of dynamic video game music implementation, as well as working. Because those are really there's really, if you're talking about video game composition, right, the music itself is one thing which you can work on, but also knowing how to work with other people, and having experience communicating with video game developers, and just collaboration in general, and those kinds of social skills are very, very crucial and imperative. And also dynamic video game music implementation, right? So, and this can get most sophisticated with things like, you know, WY's Fmod Studio. So just to give an example of some of these kinds of things, right? Not just in terms of looping, but like understanding like multiple layers of stems. Like sometimes in a video game, you might have an epic action piece of music, and then you have an additional layer of drums that can then fade in when like the boss goes to another stage. Or there's also really fun things that, like, for example, well, continuing with stems, like if you play, for example, Mario Odyssey, if you go to like a water area, or even Mario Galaxy does this, the composers for those tracks would create two different versions of the same exact track, harmonically identical, melodically identical, formally identical, same tempo, everything. But the only thing that's different is the texture, right? So like that tune, for example, I can't remember what it can't remember the name of the track, but there's kind of a light, kind of like flowy version when you're underwater. But the moment you go above water, it kind of, you know, becomes, and it's not that this one stops and the other plays. They're always simultaneously playing. You can just crossfade from one of them to the other. There are two more examples of this. One, there's a video game that I played a while back. I can't remember what it's called, where there was this helicopter, and this helicopter essentially collected pixels, and it was started out really 8-bit, and the more pixels collect, the more high definition it became. And the composer for that created an 8-bit version of every track, a sort of SNES, you know, general MIDI version of each track, you know, 16-bit, so to speak, and then a fully, you know, sampled kind of high definition version. And those all three were playing, and he cross-faded from one to the other. As the helicopter got more pixels and became more high definition, the music became more high definition. So a lot of fun things you can do. And getting into the most sophisticated, going back to using Mario Odyssey idea, if any of you have played Mario Odyssey, you'll know that Mario will sometimes jump onto, throw his cap onto like a power line and turn, and there's this thing that plays, you know, there's a little sound effect, and sometimes you'll create really simple motives like that, and if the music in the background, you know, let's just say that that's not for Mario, but let's just say that there's that playing, well, some of these would work, like that one, if you can make a slight little adjustment, right? And so sometimes what Nintendo will do, and Nintendo tends to be very, very sophisticated when it comes to dynamic music implementation for video games, sometimes what they will do is they will literally, the composer will write the whole music track in the background and then keep track of all the harmonic changes throughout that track and all the modulations, and then create a specific slight variation of that motive in terms of pitch content, but the same motive, mapped onto each one of those harmonic changes. And then the game's engine will essentially, you know, play that sound effect continuously, but each time it loops, boo doo doo, it checks to see what harmony you're on, and then picks from all the various versions of it. And so that way, that little sound effect always harmonically follows the music in the background, which is amazing and very, very clever. And this is not the case in something like Sonic, for example, where you constantly hear this, you know, first inversion major go, right? Or you know, because the problem with doing something like that is if you're always going to have the same sound effect, you know, if you're in A flat major, it sounds kind of like a creepy sound because it's bitonal, right? And so if you have musical sound effects to be able to map them, and it's interesting too, there was a interview that Rick Beato did with one of, I can't remember his name, one of the most prominent composers for like arcade and slot machines and things, way back in the day, pinball machines. And it's funny, with general MIDI and with kind of synths, you could do a lot of things really easily, like increase the tempo or make dynamic music components. Like I've talked to before about The Adventures of Monkey Island, which had dynamic music components. But later on, once kind of the PS1, and this was an interesting difference, but I'm rabbit trailing here, but I'll go for a little bit longer because it's interesting. One of the biggest generations of video game consoles that had the most difference between one another was the PS1 and the N64, right? And there are a lot of technical differences that I don't need to go into, which is interesting, you know, but because of the fact that the PS1 had slightly lower graphical capability in terms of horsepower, but it had CDs and could have a lot more data. I mean, a CD could have up to like almost like, you know, many hundreds of megabytes, whereas like a cartridge, you know, like The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time is literally like just a little over 20 megabytes, much smaller, right? So the PS1 could have more images and higher resolution textures, and that's why if you play like Final Fantasy games, you'll see really high resolution images in the background, but the characters are really low poly count. But in like the N64, the textures are lower resolution, but there's more objects on screen. Interesting trade-off. But the reason that I bring this up from the musical perspective is that with the Nintendo 64, there was a built-in kind of sound wave table synthesis kind of MIDI chip inside of the N64, and you could have a lot of music and a lot of dynamic music components because it's general MIDI, right? So for example, with The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, there are a lot of 8-bar segments for the Hyrule Field theme that would switch back and forth depending upon whether or not you're fighting an enemy or it's going in later in the day and so on and so forth. That's not something that would be possible with audio files because it would increase the number of audio files for each track necessary exponentially, that it would just, you would run out of space quickly. And so with PS1, you can have full symphony orchestras and any kind of recorded, which gives you a higher audio fidelity, but it gives you less flexibility. But nowadays, we're getting to the point where the RAM and the essentially the hardware specs of all consoles and computers and even like mobile phones is sufficiently robust that we are being able to now achieve the same kind of like puzzle piece music dynamic components with audio files that we could with general MIDI, right? But it still does require, if you're going to go in a recording section, record these separate sections, a little bit of discontinuity that results from that. But anyway, I'm getting way off on a tangent. Okay. So next question. Do you think it is essential to know German in order to appreciate Bach's vocal works? I'm having a hard time learning German. It is too hard. No, I would just say, I mean, obviously you're going to get, in terms of the text setting and the meter, and if you want to be able to write vocal music in German, then yes, learn German. But if you're just sort of understanding, I would just find like a really good translation. There are two kinds of translation, and there's a specific technical term for differentiating them that I don't remember, so forgive me, but there are two kinds of translations in vocal music. One, which kind of preserves the specific grammatical structure of the original language as closely as possible so you can see the exact word translations. But then the other one is more functionally musical, where they essentially reinterpret the grammar and get the same meaning across. But if you're writing in English, obviously the English language is different than the German language, and so you kind of reorganize things so that it's still nicely singable. So if you're specifically interested in learning the particular nature of German text setting, then yeah, you probably should learn German. But if you're just interested in learning like vocal setting in general, then probably what I would do is just do an exact direct translation, and then just, kind of pay attention to those things. But as far as, the general principles of text setting are just like, if you have any language has, like, for example, keyboard, keyboard, or what's a good example of like a Persichetti or encyclopedia, right? Encyclopedia, right? Encyclopedia. It's not an encyclopedia, it's an encyclopedia, right? So for whatever reason, in languages, we have these common kinds of ways of accenting things. And so you can follow that in the music and place those things metrically. And that's a classic problem that a lot of beginners will often have. And some people pick it up very intuitively, but when you first start to write lyrics against music, there is a problem of giving too much metrical attention to like superficial parts of speech, less important parts of speech, like articles, prepositions, things like that. You don't want to have like, I went to the store, right? I went to the store, just use a dumb little example. But so as far as like all that stuff is concerned, that's not contingent on German. That's just contingent on language in general, in which case you can use whatever language you're comfortable with and then transfer that. Like there are a lot of composers who write in Latin very effectively, and they don't necessarily become fluent in Latin. But that's another thing. If you're careful, if you're text setting in German or Latin, if you're using an existing poem in a language that you're unfamiliar with, you can pretty easily learn enough about that specific poem in the language and find someone who speaks that language to tell you where all the accent marks are and things, and then kind of get some help externally and still write a very effective piece of music for a language that you are not fluent in. But obviously, if you want to become fluent in that language, it's a lot of work, but certainly it would pay off. So yeah, I guess that's what I would say. Zach says, I commented this before and I think you hearted it, but I had an idea for you to make a monthly series where you give your viewers a theme idea brief for a composition and we post our composition. I would love to do that. I would also love to do collaborations too, where, like, for example, I was thinking it'd be a fun idea for like a bunch of people to like, write a bunch of different little, for example, initial, like all write, for example, a bar of music, just a single bar of music. And then you all write a bunch of different continuations of that bar. And then more continuations of someone else's bar. So you'll be randomly assigned. So if let's say John, whoever this random person that I'm just, sticking a name in the air, let's say John, writes bar 2, right? And then Charles, writes also a version of bar 2, and Sam also writes a version of bar 2, and they all kind of in a different way. Then like John then might write another continuation of Charles bar 2, and so on and so forth. And we could write lots of different versions of the same piece of music. It would be super fun to do different collaborations. It would be super fun for me to like take a motive or something and give it to you all, and then you kind of compose different versions and then me comment on it and things like that. So yeah, any kinds of ideas as far as those kinds of things are concerned, I definitely am interested in, and I think will be super fun. So Discord, go to my Discord server, and there's a specific channel for YouTube video ideas that you can post, and all that stuff stays there. So anytime I go and think, what YouTube video am I going to post, that's going to be a main place that I'll go to kind of scour all of your comments. And of course, Discord is free. You can just go straight. If you don't have a Discord account, you can easily make one and go right to that. There's a link to Discord, my Discord channel, and all of my YouTube videos, including this one. Okay. Regarding you teaching online music composition lessons, do you teach piano as well? I do, but I really only teach jazz piano because as far as improvisation and jazz harmony and things are concerned, I mean, I know enough about technique to I could teach someone at a kind of, maybe, let's say, I don't know what the grade levels are, but I don't really teach classical piano that often because I'm not that good at it. I don't have my brain doesn't work well in that sort of technical sense, and it's just something that I don't feel like I have enough teaching expertise in to be good at. I do rarely teach jazz improvisation and harmony and things like that, and on the piano, and have an overhead view, and I've done that with some students before, and that's been super fun. But the vast majority of my lessons, which I think is both because I enjoy it more in advertisement more, and also because people are more interested in that for me, is composition and arranging and orchestration and those types of things. So I do teach jazz piano if any of you are interested. But again, I think my skills with composition are, we'll put it this way, my piano ability is not nearly to the same level that my compositional ability is at. And so that's why I'm less comfortable teaching it. Excuse me. What are some good resources for mixing, mastering, the more technological side of music production? Unfortunately, I can't help you out with that. I can give you lots of principles of mixing and mastering, but the technical aspect of it, and sample libraries and specific, techniques for mitigating muddiness and mixing and panning and all those technical details, that's outside of that's something that I've kind of decided that I want to delegate to other people. And currently I'm using Brett. And so maybe by the way, Brett Inslee, my colleague, is going to make a YouTube channel pretty soon. And I should tell you, he is sampling my piece, Friends and Foes, and a bunch of other pieces as well. And he is developing this really sophisticated kind of like state-of-the-art kind of sampling setup. And once he's finished with that, we're going to go through that entire piece of music together and see exactly how he sampled it and go through the entire production and everything. So I don't know when that'll be. That could be a month from now or 2 months from now. It could be 2 or 3 weeks from now. It depends on when he's finished. And this initial track is going to take the longest because he's focusing on getting the workflow and the setup exactly just right. And also we're kind of developing a system where I can give him Sibelius files with annotated comments that explain to him exactly kind of what I want, that he can then translate into sampling and mixing and mastering. But yeah, unfortunately, the technological side of mixing and mastering is too far outside of my area of expertise that I can't really give you good advice about that. Sorry about that. I'd love a video going into depth about connecting themes to each other, but I feel there's very little information out there specifically to this, even in books. I would highly recommend that you check out my thematic development techniques pamphlet. It's on my Cellfly website, but there's a whole, section in there where I talk about continuity, how similar themes are to each other, how separate they are from one another, different ways to develop thematic material, and the idea of creating a new theme out of an old theme. I mean, because there are so many different ways you could do that. Like one example would be like the B section of Lost Woods, Right, so the B section there, yada da yada da da da, different harmonic progression. It's not 4-to-1; it's a 2-5-1 progression. So it's different harmonic progression, different melodies, but it's the same. Dun dun dun, it's sort of ascending melodic material that has that rhythm, bum bum bum, right? There's also a formal difference, right? Yada da 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 da, where that's still sentence structure. It's still a motive repeated, but it's sequenced. Whereas in the case of the first one, it's a closer sentence structure where it's the exact motive, dee da da dee da da. But then there's a third repetition, dee da da dee 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 dee, that leads into the continuation. So again, you can create subtle differences in some of the parameters of music, rhythm, melody, harmony, counterpoint, form, whatever, but also similarities, right? And to the degree, it's not like, oh, this is a B theme, this is an A theme. Oh, they're both the A theme, right? It's a fine spectrum of how similar something can be such that the average person might decide to call it a B theme. But then you could also find like, okay, here's an A and B theme, and they're kind of similar to one another. They're derived from each other. or one is derived from the other. And then in another case, they're so different that they seem like they're from a completely different universe. And then you can find another example that is so even more different from one theme to the other. You know, maybe you even have like a polystylistic piece of music where like the first theme is in a certain style that's totally different from like the second theme, right? But anyway, but I would say that I think based upon your question, I think actually if I could plug one of my own things that I've made, the thematic development techniques pamphlet would be something that you might be interested in looking at. Also, Schoenberg's book on music composition is really nice. And also Alan Belkin's book on music composition. I mean, this goes over a lot of it, but it really is a book on form. He doesn't really talk about the technical details of harmony and melody and or you know, those kinds of counterpoint things like that. But it's a great kind of stylistic, kind of modern, very nicely written with examples, kind of overview of kind of like the fundamental psychological principles of thematic development and form. And really, I think of thematic development as a subcategory of form, right? Form is just kind of the largest level of abstraction of the larger shapes, but you can still think of the form, you know, in the literal sense of the word. Everything has form in music, right? So there's different ways that you can think about it. But anyway. Hey, Bri. Also, maybe a video going more in depth in harmonic language, more epic style of fantasy. Yeah, I would definitely love that. Epic style of fantasy music. Think more Skyrim-y, not so much Final Fantasy. Yeah, a lot of that's just modal with like common tone modulations and things. Yeah, well, I should definitely do a video on that. Make sure to go and type that on my Discord. Hello, Admiral Fox. Are there any wind orchestra pieces, perhaps with an active percussion section, that you recommend listening to? I need to listen to a lot more wind ensemble music. I mean, I've listened to some Frank Kelly. I've listened to In the Mountains Rising Nowhere. I've listened to, what's his name? He writes very flourishing, fast, energetic, minimalist music. He's written a ton of band music. And there's another famous Percy Grainger. Percy Grainger has a lot of really, really interesting band music that I would highly recommend you listen to. But that is a genre. I've written one wind ensemble piece, and I do find it to be very interesting and fun. And it's also a great genre to write music for and get it performed, because you're much more likely to get a wind ensemble piece performed than you are to get an orchestral piece performed. And that's just, you know, the reasons why is a story for another time. But I wish I could give you more recommendations as far as that's concerned. But I know I have a much broader knowledge base of chamber and orchestral music than wind ensemble music, which is funny since I kind of studied under Jay Bocook, who's like a wind ensemble guy. But I definitely need to listen to more wind ensemble music. So anyone who has any recommendations as far as that is concerned should definitely send me some if they're so inclined. Okay. What's a good way to learn orchestration? I read through all of the study of orchestration, but now I don't know how to practice all the info I learned from it. Okay, so first thing, I want to differentiate between instrumentation and orchestration. A lot of people. Okay, this is a good question. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this question, maybe like at least like 5 or 10 minutes. Orchestration. Okay. The Adler is better than most in terms. Well, first, let me define the difference between instrumentation and orchestration, right? So instrumentation is really just learning the particular technical capabilities and idiomaticisms of the individual instruments, right? Which timbre or whatever. And then texture, whatever you want to call it, you know, orchestration is learning how to combine them together in ways that produce good balance, produce good blend, you know, produce good idiomaticism. And so as far as orchestration is concerned, I would think about it in a few different ways. So one, I would think about 4 kind of primary kinds of textures. And each one of these have kind of different ways to be treated. And if you focus on them individually, I think it'll help you out kind of organize. So orchestration is such a broad, the orchestra is such a large setup, and there's so much orchestral music, and it's also complicated. It's really easy to get overwhelmed when learning orchestration. So first thing, if you don't know every single tiny little range and instrument and detail and what particular fingering and the slap, there's a tendency of orchestration teachers to make you think that you need to learn all that stuff immediately, but no. Just learn enough so that way you're writing things that are at the very least decently playable. Learn the basic ranges of the instrument. And even if you don't have for a long time, I didn't even have the ranges of the instruments memorized. I just listened to so much orchestral music that I had a general idea, and then I just used Sibelius to kind of give me an idea. But then I got a more sophisticated understanding over time, and then I started to write less conservative music. I think that's generally a good idea. Start out writing conservative orchestration, middles of ranges, not things that are too complicated, and then you can learn idiomatic techniques. Okay, so there are really two kinds of textures in orchestration. There are idiomatic textures, and we can think of this as a spectrum, you know, it's sort of like poles in the spectrum. So there's kind of more idiomatic orchestration. And then on the other side, there's kind of more kind of generalized orchestration. So for example, if you write like a 4-part writing structure with some nice kind of stepwise smooth melodies, you know, that all work together, a nice little 4-part chorale or something, that is such a versatile and simple structure that it could work well with almost any combination of instruments as long as you put them in nice ranges and balance them halfway decently. But something like, for example, to use the classic example that I always give, you know, that's something that is a figuration that works very nicely, and you can see John Williams does this all the time. And string instruments, right, because they're tuned in fifths, and so an open voicing, putting your fingers right and playing a triple stop, and then moving your bow up and down. That's something that specifically this bowed string instruments do really nicely. That is very difficult for even a pianist to do, let alone a wind instrument, right? So learning those little tricks of like, ooh, what can the flute do? That's a unique technique. Those are all great to learn, but learn those later. First, just focus on like, can I take a chorale and just balance and blend it? The hard thing about balance is that the instruments are not always exactly mapped onto one another or correlated when it comes to dynamics, both in terms of their own range and also in terms of different instruments. So obviously a mezzo forte flute is not as loud as a mezzo forte trumpet, right? And at the same time, a mezzo forte flute in its higher register is not as loud as a mezzo forte flute in its lower register. Good players try to achieve some kind of consistency and blend with one another, but having an understanding of kind of dynamic conversion is really important. This is something that I talk a lot about, especially in my how to write like John Williams videos, you know, sometimes, and there's a discussion to be had about whether or not you want to over micromanage dynamics, right? There's the kind of more classical Mozartian idea is just forte or piano, which kind of Thomas Goss is more of a fan of. I'm more of a fan of micromanaging a little bit more, which is kind of more of a media scoring thing, because if you're going to go and write music that's going to be recorded in a live recording session, there's not a lot of rehearsal time. And so you really have to be very specific about what dynamic markings you want, but you don't want to treat it like a DAW. You don't want to think, oh, I'm going to move this, you know, you don't want to think of it like mixing faders. There is an ethos and a kind of emotional content and psychological connotation that comes along with different, you know, some people say that mezzo piano is like non-committal. Piano is more committal. You know, I think some of that's kind of BS, but at the same time, some of it depends on the players that you're writing for and what context, right? You know, if you're writing for LA film scoring sessions, they want you to tell them exactly what they want and they'll play, and you can trust that they're musical enough that they'll get it to work out. But at the same time, if you're performing some like Mozart symphony, there's a certain fun and artistry that comes from a conductor and musicians kind of creating an interpretation that may not necessarily reflect exactly the basic dynamics that Mozart wrote, but it's not that Mozart did anything bad. It's just that Mozart sort of delegated the fine tuning to the conductor and the orchestra. But anyway, so balance is very, very important as a kind of basic thing. Blend is also very, very important. Understanding which instruments blend with each other and which ones don't. And there are several charts that I can send you. Maybe I should just make like a folder, a Google Drive folder, where I hand out some of these charts and things. That would be useful, because there are a lot of charts that are helpful as far as this thing is concerned. Two books that I would highly recommend you get to give you more of an idea of orchestration and kind of tips and tricks and techniques as opposed to the instrumentation, which is what most orchestration manuals do, are Thomas Goss's 100 Orchestration Tips and 100 More Orchestration Tips. They're both like $25 each. They're phenomenal books. They're some of my favorite music books that have ever been made. They're organized according to each section of the orchestra, and they're very digestible too. Like one tip is just like a couple pages long, and it gives you some practical advice and a musical example, and it's just really, really phenomenal. The other thing is score study is really, really important. And at first, don't worry so much about specifically score studying. Just kind of look at what's happening, right? So if you take a piece of music, like, for example, like Adventures on Earth, right, you know, by John Williams, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. Bum, 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 bum. You know, even if you don't know what the specific pitches are or how to transpose a B-flat clarinet or what on earth this little X means, even if you don't know any of that stuff, you can just look at it and say, okay, well, the winds seem to have this kind of thing, bam, 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 and you can hear that. Okay, cool. So the winds, and they're playing the same thing as the strings. And then you go and look more specifically, and you see that they're doubling each other. And so then an idea comes, okay, sometimes different instruments play the same thing, and it's like combining the color yellow and blue, and you get green, right? And so when you combine sections together, then you can just notice, okay, are these two different sounds that then create a complementary sound, or are they the same sound that kind of reinforce the same overtone series? Or, is it a case of like interlocking? And there are a lot of patterns and things that you can notice without even like reading the specific pitches on the page, right? And then like here, for example, just the glockenspiel is just playing ding, 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 ding. So notice how the Glock normally just plays the note G, which is the main note that the upper parts are playing, but it doesn't play the same figuration. And then why? And then you could think about it and think, okay, well, what do I know about the glockenspiel from my Samuel Adler book? The glockenspiel has a really long sustain, right? And it has a kind of piercing sound. And then so you think to yourself, okay, well, maybe John Williams is just using the glockenspiel for an accent, and he plays the full motive just for a moment to give a little bit of shimmer, but he doesn't want to do it the whole time because then it's just going to overpower everything and be kind of annoying to listen to the ears. And then you think, okay, therefore I've learned a little trick. If I have an instrument like the glockenspiel that has a really long sustain and is very kind of powerful, I can create a kind of simplified version of it in the doubling so that it can help out, but it's not an exact doubling. And then the second level is to abstract that principle out and apply it to another instrument. Like maybe you can have bass drum doubling timpani, but it only doubles specific notes of the timpani, or same thing with contrabass and cello. And then once you have that pattern, then you're looking for that. And then you'll go and see another piece of music like Holst, Jupiter Holst, right? And Jupiter by Holst, and then you'll notice that, oh, he does the same thing with the Glock. And then you start to see all these patterns and connections. And then once you become more comfortable with that and you develop your theoretical skills, then you can go in and do like specifically a harmonic analysis and contrapuntal analysis and melodic analysis and thematic development and all those things. But as far as the texture is concerned, the basic thing that you want to do is just identify what all of the different elements are, right? And you can do this on a page like very simply, like right here, for example. Most textures are pretty simple. That's another thing too, like orchestral music, yes, it's complicated, but like right here, these are both very, very simple textures, right? Right here, we just have the horns going bum 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 bum, right? Just playing like nice sixths, right? And an octave with a little sixth in between, and then doubled by first and second violins and violas. And you notice horns and violins and violas. That's a very, very common doubling. You hear that also in Holst, bum bum ba da da dee da da da. Horns doubling with strings. And then you think, okay, well, cellos and contrabasses and bassoons and contrabassoons are just literally just playing a pedal G, just bam, boom. That's all that they're playing. That's the whole texture, right? So John Williams, this composer who is capable of creating all this sophisticated complexity, sometimes as many as 6 layers, decided that at that moment, this simple texture is exactly just right. And so that's another thing. A lot of composers starting out get so excited about the complexity, and then they think that they'll always have to be having everyone going. But a lot of orchestral textures are just combinations. So the final thing that I'll say as far as orchestration is concerned is, also follow Thomas Goss's YouTube channel, which is very useful, and also score analysis videos and things like that. But anyway, the final thing I'll say about orchestration is just a differentiation between 4 different kinds of textures. So you can have a soloist accompanied by the orchestra. And that is a very specific kind of thing. So like Schindler's List, for example, violin supported by, or the terminal clarinet supported by orchestra, or, the Force theme, French horn supported by orchestra, or tuba in Close Encounters of the Third Kind supported by orchestra, or bass clarinet in Home Alone. You can, even just looking through the catalog of John Williams, you can find an example of every single solitary instrument having a solo, Across the Stars, oboe, flute, BFG, what have I missed here? Horn, I think we already said horn, trumpet, of course, the Star Wars theme, and even also JFK has some solo trumpet stuff, and trombone, Darth Vader's theme, and so on and so forth. So anyway, so the specific way that you can write a soloist accompanied by orchestra involves a lot of dynamic compensation, and then you can study concerti, right? Concertos, which are the kind of, there's so many wonderful concerti written for almost every instrument, that's a great sort of body of work that you can use to focus on. How do I write a solo accompanied by orchestra and make sure that that's balanced for one, and that's kind of each instrument has its own kind of thing, right? Like harp, for example, right? When John Williams wrote his harp concerto on Williams and Birches for Ann Hobson Pilot, who's the principal harpist of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, whom John Williams was the conductor of for many years, the Boston Pops. when he wrote that piece of music, he omitted a lot of the brass section and some of the percussion to sort of lighten it up, so that way the harp could sort of be heard as well. And also too, there is some kind of compensation that can be made in terms of like acoustically placement of instruments. If you're writing for a concerto, you know, a violinist playing a solo in the context of a Mahler symphony might just stay where they are. But if it's like Hilary Hahn playing Mendelssohn's E minor violin concerto, she's going to be out in front, you know, playing everything, and which is going to give her a greater dynamic compensation. And you can also, you know, mix things in a certain way. But anyway, that's the first category. Second category is just chorale writing. You know, so if you're just writing for a particular section, people often think it's just like strings, brass, woodwinds, but I wouldn't categorize it like that. I would categorize it like strings, right? And then conical and cylindrical brass, right, which are really kind of different things that blend well in, like trumpets and trombones blend immaculately together. Horns and tubas blend immaculately together. They can blend quite well together, all of them, but there is, you know, things like interlocking voicing, stacked voicing, you know, when to use one or the other. Those kinds of things can be helpful. But anyway, those are the kind of two sections I would categorize for the brass section. And then for the woodwind section, I would categorize the single reeds, the double reeds, and the flutes, right? And they, you know, a clarinet section will balance very nicely with, and if you have winds and fours, you can have like a 4-part writing. You can have like, you know, an E flat clarinet, 2 B flat clarinets, and a bass clarinet, or 2 B flat clarinets and 2 B flat bass clarinets, and have a nice little 4-part writing. You don't have to worry about them blending, but anytime you start combining together instruments from different families, that's when we get into the category of composite orchestration. But anyway, so just chorale writing, just writing within a particular section is the kind of the second category of orchestral textures. And then tutti, right? So tutti, the word tutti, T-U-T-T-I, I'm actually not sure what it directly translates into. I should know this, but I'm pretty sure it's an Italian term. But in any case, it just means when everyone is going, when the full band is going for the big kind of section. And there's this misconception that often happens where people think that tuttis are the most complex kind of textures to write because you have so many people going. But in another way, because you have so many people going, it reduces the amount of possible textures that can work because of the number of constraints that are on the texture at that moment. And so tutti writing, in any case, is a very specific kind of thing with kinds of techniques for balancing and things. And so that's, again, a case where if you're kind of saying, okay, this month I'm going to study tutti writing, just go through all your favorite pieces and mark out all the tuttis and just study them and then organize it in that way. And then, of course, finally, the kind of fourth category, which is sort of the miscellaneous category, is composite orchestration, right? Combining together, you know, so we have vibraphone playing a little thing in combination with pizzicato, and then flutes going. And I tend to write mostly in composite orchestration, although I try to have a balance of lots of different textures. But at the end of the day, you want to be able to, you know, as a composer, or good orchestrator, be able to achieve any one of these. And to some degree, there is overlap between them, but I've personally found that differentiating those 4 kinds of textures and focusing on them individually and having a kind of way of going about it, not a cookie cutter method, but general principles that you can follow are very, very helpful, so that when you actually go and write a piece of music, which is going to use all 4 textures at different moments, depending upon what you want to go for aesthetically, you can kind of organize your thought instead of just like reinventing the wheel and starting from first principles at every bar. Anyway, so there's at least some information regarding orchestration. Have you listened to the Ghost of Tsushima original score yet? It's great. My favorite piece of the Way of the Samurai and the Forgotten Song. I have not. Please send me a message somewhere, email recommending those pieces of music, because I always love listening to new music. The audio links are not shown in your PDF 20s. Yes, sorry. The audio, I'm still in the process of getting the audio from Brett Inslee, but the final version of the book, which will I'm actually going to visit my parents. They're in a fifth wheel, and I'll be staying with them. And it'll be fun too, because I'll have a lot of free time to focus on finishing the book and kind of nice, you know, beautiful environment. So I'm really close to finishing it. But the moment that I'm done, I basically can't add those audio files until I compile everything together with Adobe Acrobat and link all of the different things, and I have to embed each of the individual audio files, and that implies finalizing all of the illustrations. So that's something that I'm going to do in the final version of the book, which, I mean, should be done in less than a month. But again, I'm not going to give myself a deadline this time, but I'm working. That's my primary focus. I'm spending the vast majority of my time, you know, focusing on finishing that book. And so yeah, my apologies that the audio links are not there, but they will be in the final version. Can you play some multi clavier preludes, please? Maybe I'll play the C major prelude because it's so easy. But what is the best way to improve at counterpoint? That's a good question. Let me think about it. Okay, 2 things to start out with. One, I'm not a huge fan of the species counterpoint approach. And I've said this before, but kind of unclearly. So let me see if I can say it in a clearer way now. The reason that I'm not a fan, well, first off, let me tell you what the species counterpoint approach is for those who don't know it, right? Most of the time, if you learn counterpoint in the Baroque, most books on counterpoint are like in a Baroque idiom or a Palestrinian kind of 16th century kind of idiom, right? And there are important distinctions between the two, but books focus too much on the stylistic differences between the two as opposed to the general principles, right? And there's also baggage that comes. So like, for example, like always resolve this to this. It's like, why? You know, like what if I want to resolve this to this? So I think it's more important that you understand the process and nature of coming up with a coherent contrapuntal system as opposed to, you know, just immediately adopting a particular contrapuntal system, which is always going to make it difficult for you to write stylistically different counterpoint, but that's still effective counterpoint. Okay. General principles of counterpoint, right? Harmonic coherency. When you write the lines, you want them to make sure that they add up to something vertically that at the very least you are aware of and want, if, you know, and some idioms are more linearly focused, like Palestrinian counterpoint tends to be kind of more, I mean, they do focus on creating vertical triadic sonorities and things like that, but there's not as much a sense of like picking the chords first and then writing the counter lines. Whereas another way of writing counterpoint is like coming up with a harmonic structure and then layering on counterpoint, which is really like what I teach in my part writing book, right? But it's still really just counterpoint. But in that case, the counterpoint is an extra layer of decoration as opposed to being composed for its own sake. But anyway, okay, so 3 principles. So harmonic coherency, whatever that means for you and what you're trying to compose. Second principle is independence, right? And there are 2 kinds of independence. There's melodic independence or we'll be more specific and say intervallic independence as opposed to rhythmic independence. And you don't necessarily always have to have both simultaneously, but as long as you have just one, then you can achieve independence. Now, sometimes you don't want to have independence. Sometimes you want to, even in the case of a contrapuntally written piece of music, and that's the problem with these terms is like, oh, I'm writing counterpoint. And so then if you say to yourself, I'm writing counterpoint, you get to bar 7 and you're like, oh, do I want to have parallel sixths for 6 notes in a row? And then it's like, but then then it's not counterpoint because it's not independent. And it's like, well, maybe so, but at the same time, you might want to give the ear a relief, you know, from that. And it's not as if counterpoint is defined by the maximization of independence, you know, necessarily. And you go and listen to Bach's fugues, and he has a bunch of parallelism all over the case, you know, parallel imperfect consonances, especially for Bourdon, things like that. A lot of it is finding a balance between contrapuntal density that kind of excites you, but then at the moment that you feel like you're getting overwhelmed, it kind of relaxes. And a great example of this is I think it's the D minor. I think it's. If you know what I'm talking about. Sorry, it's my phone. Let me silence it. But if you know what I'm talking about, it's a very short. There's a video on YouTube of an animation by Smallin. So type in SMALIN Bach double violin concerto and just listen to that first movement. It's just 3.5 minutes. And notice how it has really dense, complex contrapuntal kind of ritornellos. Ritornellos meaning like the orchestra, because it's a concerto. So you'd have, well, we won't get into the Baroque idiom, but bottom line, complex contrapuntal density, and then he sort of like the moment that you feel like you can't take anymore, he just like simplifies it. This nice melody with a simple homophonic, you know. So we think of Bach as this contrapuntal composer, but he wrote simple homophonic accompaniments all the time. So it's important to realize that it's not like you're writing counterpoint or not writing counterpoint. It's that counterpoint is a particular process of generating a certain kind of musical texture with certain kinds of priorities and orders of operations that can achieve a certain aesthetic that you may or may not want for a particular section of music, but you should always end up, you know, try to be as flexible about it as possible. But anyway, to go back to the original thing that I was going to bring up, which is why I dislike species counterpoint, is because it focuses on each individual idiom by itself. So a species counterpoint, it's sort of like you start with note against note, where they're both the same rhythm. How do you write first species counterpoint? And then the second counterpoint, it's 2 notes against 1 note, right? And then there are only like 5 species. But if you're going to go and be detailed about that, I mean, if you can have 3 notes against 1 note with like triplets, right? There are, and also like, you know, people talk about suspensions, but suspensions require a certain kind of resolution. There are all kinds of quasi-suspensions that sound really satisfying to the ears. And there are all kinds of embellishing tones that we use all the time today that just were not considered to be okay back in the Baroque and classical period. And so, you know, I dislike the species counterpoint rubric, both because it focuses and is based on stylistic limitations that may not be interested to someone who's wanting to learn counterpoint generally to apply to lots of different musical styles. And secondly, because I don't think differentiating those are a good idea, because then when you try and put them all together, it's sort of like when you learn instrumentation, you'd be like, okay, the violin, got it. Second violin, got it. Funnily enough, the same instrument. Viola, got it. Cello, got it. Double bass, and so on and so forth. And then when you get to the whole orchestra, you're just like, I don't know what to do. It's the same thing with counterpoint, right? It's like first species got it, second species got it, third species got it. But then in the context of then actually just writing music and trying to make melodies, that doesn't help you learn how to, write counterpoint in that sense. So I'm definitely going to try and make more videos on counterpoint in the future, but hopefully some of those things and ideas, kind of will help you out. There's also a contemporary counterpoint book by Berkeley Press. It's not my favorite, but it's pretty good. It's pretty good. I would recommend it at the very least. Good principles are concerned. It's astylistic. It's modernly written. So that would be a good book that I would recommend. As far as contemporary counterpoint is concerned. As far as 16th century counterpoint is concerned, I've mentioned this book before, but Robert Galden's 16th century counterpoint is a great book as far as that specific idiom is concerned. Anyway, okay. Do you have any suggestions for scores to study for someone who wants to learn how to compose / orchestrate film and game music? Loving your content. I'm so glad you love my content. Thank you. That's a very okay. That's difficult. There are a lot. How to compose and orchestrate film and game music. Bob, see if you can tell me specifically if are there any particular subcategories of film. Like, do you like kind of Japanese style video game music more? Do you kind of like more AAA kind of film scorey kind of style video game music? Do you like more jazzy kinds of things? Do you like ambient electron? There are a lot of different genres, right, of both film and game music. And film music is kind of the Hans Zimmer kind of style. There's kind of the more experimental kind of style. There's the classical John Williams kind of style. So I mean, I could just go and recommend a variety, but maybe you can give me an idea of, at the very least, some kind of initial priorities that you have as far as specific kinds of film and game music that you're interested in writing, specific subcategories, and may help me to narrow that down a bit. When composing in a DAW with VSTs, don't you find yourself limited by the sounds you're able to achieve from it? Maybe one of the reasons why orchestral programming often sounds very similar. I don't want to say no, because then it sounds like I'm saying I'm not. Well, honestly, sometimes yes, but I think the answer is no. And I want to take myself out of the equation. So let's take myself completely out of the equation, just talk about it in abstraction. I don't think there's any excuse for not being creative, no matter whether or not you're writing for a 5-note kalimba or, every possible instrument ever written, right? So the fact that so many scores sound similar, there are a lot of reasons why that might be the case, right? Temp tracks, right? The tastes of those who are preemptively deciding what kind of music they want in their project, whether that's the producer, the director, whomever. You listening to a lot of music of the same category, watching a lot of videos explaining a certain kind of process of writing with samples, right? Certainly, changing sample libraries or increasing the variety, of the kind of instrumentation things that you compose with can help create different sounds. But at the same time, that it's important for that not to be a crutch, right? And so, I think another thing that's important to understand too is that there are sort of common styles that exist from sort of one musical era to another musical era, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But if you want to go outside of that creatively, right, there are two questions here. One, can you do that and not get fired? And sometimes I've gotten fired for those types of things because I'm an a-hole as far as that stuff is concerned. No, I try to be nice and polite, but sometimes if there's a kind of creative decision that they want me to implement and I absolutely hate it, then I'll just essentially say to them politely, kind of like, I don't think I'm able to give you exactly the style that you want. Can I recommend this other composer? I try to be really nice and polite about it. But then there are a bunch of other composers who to me are just like amazing. And I wish I was able to do that. There are a bunch of other composers who are like chameleons and they can just give any director exactly what they want. And a lot of us snobs, myself included, of course, as the biggest snob of all of them, will sometimes look at that and be like, oh, they're always writing music the same, cookie cutter, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, like, can I give exactly what they want in exactly the way that they want it in a tight deadline, while at the same time not having copyright infringement and still giving some extra level of creativity. That's difficult to write with that kind of constraint. To say that one is bored by the end result is different than to say that one is unimpressed by the skill and craft required to be able to write inside of those constraints, right? So enough said about that. That's a big, giant kind of subjective topic. Do you need math or music theory? You just want to learn it for fun? You don't really need math or music theory at all. I just want to learn it for fun. And I do think that it does give an interesting basic rudimentary math, like for example, like logarithms and understanding the mathematical pattern of like the harmonic series, and even just like basic geometry and how that is manifested in music, so I don't think that it's just for fun in the sense that it's completely irrelevant, but just something that I'm doing merely for fun. I do think that it can provide, ways of understanding and conceptualizing music that can be helpful and supplementary, but I don't think it's necessary to be able to have to write good music. I think it's more something that I'm interested in doing from a teaching and theoretical perspective, and also just because I'm a nerd. So I would say, as far as you're concerned, if you're interested, if you feel like if mathematical patterns interest you and your brain feels like that unlocks understanding, then definitely learn it. But if you feel like your brain does not work discursively like that, and you have a kind of more intuitive way of going about things, then certainly follow your intuitions, right? Because there's nothing right. And it's very, 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 very rare that you find someone who's like equally right and left-brained at music, right? I'm definitely more left-brained than right-brained. I do write music ultimately emotionally and intuitionally, but my music is very carefully often logically composed, logical systems that are designed to kind of produce emotional responses that then I check against to see whether or not they sound sincere in what I want to try and accomplish. But I don't go straight from it's not like my brain just tells me what to write. There are a lot of amazing musicians out there who write amazing stuff, and their brains just tell them what to write. And they've developed these intuitions in a way that, I have not developed, and maybe I don't even have the capacity to develop. So part of it is just thinking about your own personality and psyche and what kind of what your strengths and weaknesses are, and just thinking about whether or not it would be useful to you and enjoyable. And I think enjoyable is important, right? It's especially with music. It's like if it's useful but it's not enjoyable, it's like at the end of the day, if it's not enjoyable, then it's music. It's not science we're talking about. It's not building a rocket. It's expressing emotion. So the math should never get in the way of that or usurp that. It should only ever be just a kind of interesting conceptualization, just like the color wheel. It's like each color has its own, like emotional, subjective content to it, qualia, that is just inexplicable by words, right? What it feels like to look at the color green as opposed to what it feels like to look at the color red. There's nothing, at least currently, that can mathematically come close to explaining why that's the case. But you can still, as an artist, learn about the subtle differences between like shading and the color wheel, and how to mix colors and the light spectrum and subtractive versus additive colors, and shade and tone, and how that's affected on computer. So you can learn all these technical details if they're useful to you to be able to control colors more specifically. But ultimately, that should never replace the emotional reason why you choose the color red in a certain context as opposed to another context. Anyway. Do you need math or music theory? You just want to learn it for fun? I already read that question. Silly me. Everyone hit that like button. What's the Beethoven song he played? Anyone? Oh, which one did I play? I played the C minor Pathetique Sonata, Beethoven, third movement, which is the rondo. If that's the one that you were talking about, that's that. Can you explain how to write in sonata form? I think I'll go back to kind of what I said about the previous kind of formal. I can explain the basics of sonata form. Sonata form essentially really comes into three parts, right? There's the exposition, where you kind of present your material. Here are my tunes, right? And then you mess around with the tune. Well, I'll use an analogy. So let's say that you're reading a book, and it's like chapter 1, Bob. Bob is a computer programmer. Bob, And then chapter 2, you know, Mary's an artist, you know, to do the contrasting, whatever. And I know I'm being stereotypical, you know, we might as well make Mary the computer program and Bob the artist. It doesn't matter. It's just completely arbitrary. But anyway, and you kind of learn about them individually, and then they meet each other, right? And then they have, and then you kind of, even though you know about them individually, when they meet each other, something new happens, and you can't really expect what it would be. And you think about that with regards to friends too. Like, you know, sometimes I know a certain friend so well, and he's got this vibe, and I know another friend so well, and he's got this vibe, or he or she or whatever. And then they've got different vibes, and I know them for like 4 years, but then suddenly they meet each other, and it's like my brain explodes, because it's like I can't even imagine what it would be like if they meet each other. And it's really interesting how that happens. But anyway, so think about it like that. It's like with sonata form, you have a primary theme and a secondary theme, but it's not like one is. That just means that one comes first and the other one comes second. It doesn't mean that one's more important than the other, right? But yeah, so you present one theme and then another theme, and they kind of contrast each other, right? And you maybe you have a transition to get from one to the other, or maybe an abrupt cut. It doesn't really matter. You know, both are possible. And then you have a development section where you mix those themes together and toy around with them. And then a recapitulation where you essentially kind of come back to the beginning. And that's essentially a developmental kind of form where you present material at the beginning, and then you break it apart and explore it, right? Which is the opposite of cumulative form, where you start with individual strands, and then eventually they come together to build something towards the end. And you can have both interweaving simultaneously. But anyway, there are more specific stylistic details, like the second theme is often in the dominant of the first theme. And when the second theme comes back in the recapitulation, because both themes come back in the recapitulation, oftentimes the second theme is now in the tonic, you know, even though it was in the dominant. So you kind of have this large scale dominant resolved to tonic. You know, whether anyone hears that is another question. And that kind of gets into a little bit of Schenkerian analysis. We're talking about larger and smaller scales. But basic idea is present theme A, present theme B, mess around with them. And then when you've had enough of messing around with them, play them both again, and then tack on a coda and call it a day. That's really sonata form, you know, in a nutshell. Okay. Are you a listener of Yanni? Yes! I love Yanni. And it's funny because Yanni is definitely someone that a lot of people think are cheesy. A lot of people criticize him. He doesn't write that complex music, but I love Yanni. He's a great melodist. He's very emotionally oriented. I love Santorini. I love Keys to Imagination. I love Sand Dance. I love, I'd love to do a video, honestly, on some of Yanni's music. And I love Yanni too, because like he gets so many fantastic musicians from around the world. Like whenever he has a live show, he's never the star of the show. Like he's always playing stuff, and it's always his tunes. And sometimes he is the star of the show, but he just constantly is like, look at this wonderful Armenian harpist. And then he just looks over in the harp. It's almost like jazz. It's like world music style, but it's jazz in the sense that with jazz, you play a tune, and then the different performers take turns soloing improvised solos, sometimes prepared, but most of the time improvised, on top of the harmonic changes of the tune. And then at the end, the tune comes back and wraps it up. But it gives so the tune is there, and it gives a framework for everyone. And it's a beautiful tune with Yanni. He's a great melodist. But then, the albums is just him playing the tunes, right? But when he has these live shows and invites all these other musicians, he gives them all chances to play solos, and he invites musicians from all over the world with different musical traditions, and I just love that. I love that so much. So I would highly recommend anyone listen to, especially Yanni's live shows and stuff like that. So yeah, no, I love Yanni. How to write a melody, part 404 is not on your channel. Please double it. Yeah, well, just FYI for everyone confused about that. The entire series is just 3 parts, right? Emotional impact, catchiness, and originality. The 4th video, which I do need to upload, and I am going to upload, is just going to be a series of analyses of melodies. I'm literally just going to be going through and talking about all the principles that we talked about in the 3rd one. We're going through a bunch of different melodies. And I'm probably going to have a part 4A, part 4B, part 4C, and just continue adding to it, like 10 melodies per video. And people can submit melodies that they kind of want me to analyze, and we'll kind of analyze them. But so I am going to upload part 4 at some point, but that is not going to present new actual insight necessarily, because, I mean, I'm sure there's more that I could say as far as the first 3 videos are concerned, and maybe I'll remake them in the future. But the core content and the original way that I developed the series is in 3 parts. That 4th video is essentially just a bonus video that's going to have a bunch of additional analyses. But I really do think personally that as far as tunes are concerned, melody writing can be kind of split into those 3 categories, and that I really kind of cover most of the material, at least the way that I conceptualize and view melody and tunes with the first 3 videos. What are the orchestration books that you like? I mean, yeah, so again, the Adler I think is the best, the Samuel Adler, as far as orchestration books are concerned. I mean, there are a lot of other ones. There's the Forsyth. There's the but the thing is, most of those are kind of outdated, and also in terms of instrumentation. The Rimsky-Korsakov principles of orchestration is useful if you're really familiar with his music. So here's the thing: if you're just starting with orchestration, do not go to Rimsky-Korsakov principles of orchestration. But if you listen to all of his music, you know, the Tale of Tsar Sultan and the Scheherazade and so on and so forth, all of his ballets and things. If you listen to all of that music and become really familiar with it, then when you go and read the book and you see he's basically just telling you why he orchestrated the music in the way that he did. But if you're just looking at the sheet music and aren't familiar with his music, you don't really learn much. So that is a great book to learn as a kind of secondary supplement orchestration. But as I said earlier, Samuel Adler, and then the 100 Orchestration Tips by Thomas Goss, 1 and 2. Definitely get those. Follow his YouTube channel. And there are some other blogs and things that I can mention as well. But yeah. Okay. Wow, it's already an hour and 45 minutes. Time just passes so long. Let me see if I can find the next question. Cheers. Have you used psychedelics before? If so, how did it affect your creativity? Yes, and I don't know if I should say this publicly, right? But I'll save a specific account of that for a later time when I'm kind of ready to announce that to the world. But yes, and it has affected my creativity and both my well-being very, very positively. And so I've had some very, very transformative experiences with psychedelics, and I'll talk about those in another time. But just to be terse about it, do you have any favorite jazz albums? Yes, but at the same time, I also have a lot of favorite jazz recordings. For me, it's not albums as much as just it's specific recordings. I'm just going to mention a few because otherwise I'll just go crazy. The live version of John Coltrane and his quartet, I think it's a quartet. It might be a trio. No, it's a quartet. It's definitely a quartet because it's piano, saxophone, bass, and drums. Yeah, the live version of that in black and white. You can find it on YouTube of my favorite things. Oh, one of my favorites ever. Also, Tiger and Hamasyan, anything that he's ever done, especially his live shows. And What the Waves Brought, not really jazz, kind of jazz mixed with like some world influences. Chris Potter and what's his name? I will remember it if I think about it, but let me just look it up. Chris Potter is a phenomenal saxophonist. There's a recording of him playing Moment's Notice live with his quartet, which is amazing. Oh yeah, Shy Maestro. Chris Potter, All the Things You Are. You can see that. That is just probably my current favorite jazz recording of all time. Also, Bill Evans, All the Things You Are is just fantastic. Keith Jarrett has a lot of phenomenal. I mean, I could go on and on and on and on and on. Maybe I should make a list on my website of like my music recommendations at some point, but those are some ones that I would immediately check out. Obviously, Miles Davis' Kind of Blue is a classic kind of like modal jazz album. I'd also recommend checking out a lot of names. It'll come to me. He literally did a master class. I know him super well. It's so funny. So sometimes names will literally just pop out of my head, even of like my friends and my siblings. Probably like a cognitive disease that I have. Okay. When composing in a DAW, do you find what is the longest piece? Oh wait, let me back up. Okay, I don't have a lot of. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put. I'm going to highlight. I'm being silly. I'm going to highlight the question I'm on. That way, I can immediately go to the next one. I don't have a lot of experience writing endings because I often abandon pieces before they are finished. Yeah, that's tough. Is that because a lack of motivation? Or I would recommend you check out my writer's block video. That's what I recommend you do. What is the longest piece you've composed? Do you find it harder in terms of overall cohesion? How do you think classical will achieve this? Well, a lot of the classicists achieve it by following forms, but at the same time, it's just, again, a matter of experience, right? Like Mahler wrote like, pretty much only symphonies with the exception of some chamber music and song cycles and things, very long ones. And so he got really, really accustomed to those kind of larger scale forms. I think ultimately it's just the larger a piece of music is, the more contrasting sections you can have, the more material you can have, the subtler you can be. The shorter the piece of music, the less material you have, the more unity there needs to be, and the more direct you need to be. Those are just kind of general principles, right? But it's also useful to think about larger scale goalposts and to not overly micromanage. It's easy with a minute piece to micromanage everything, 16 bars of this, 18 bars of this, and so on and so forth. But if you're writing, like for example, my symphony, I've always brought up this example, so forgive me if you've heard this before, but like my symphony number 1 is a good example where I came up with a melody, da da dee 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 dee, you know, that tune. First, I just said, okay, I want to come up with a tune. For whatever reason, this idea came to me. I want to come up with a tune that is, when you play it without the harmony, it sounds weird and incoherent and chromatic, and it doesn't make sense. But when you play it with the harmony, if I can remember even how I harmonized it. And I think it's like... something like that, right? And I harmonize it in different ways, especially in like the 4th movement and stuff. But it's a melody that was specifically designed to be weird by itself, but it makes sense with the harmony. So then I thought, okay, I'm going to play the melody at the beginning of the piece, first thing, and everyone's going to be like, what on earth is this weird melody? And then hopefully have some climax later where it returns and with the harmony. And so what I did was I wrote the climax first, and then I played at the beginning of the piece of music with the double bass, you know, kind of the low ominous bass, you know, kind of section. And then I came up with a secondary theme, yum da 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 dum dee da da, which by the way, it sounds like a Fire Emblem song that was composed later. I'm sure it's just totally coincidental. There's a great Fire Emblem battle track. I can't remember the specific name of it. That dee 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 dum 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 dum. But anyway, side note. So then I just thought, okay, I played this little tune, and now I'm just going to, and then what I did is I just experimented. I used that little secondary motive and then little bits, boom, boom, bum, 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 right? Little bits, or, you know, little toying around with the idea motivically. And essentially, I didn't decide how long it was going to be, right? I just went from left to right, and I know I already had written that climax, and so I just was sort of like writing until I felt that it was the right moment, and then I went to the climax, right? And then once I had that, then I sort of listened to that and then thought, okay, what am I going to have after this? Well, this is all A and B, so maybe I can have some contrasting material, and so they invented some contrapuntal contrasting material, kind of intuitively, right? And so on and so forth. And that particular piece of music, I don't think is the best formally. I think it's a little disjointed, right? I'm not going to revise it. I'm not a fan of revising music personally, because like, even if a piece of music that I wrote is very imperfect, which that first, you know, symphony is, I still enjoyed listening to it because it's an accurate representation of me as a composer at the time. And you can listen to the symphony from beginning to end, and yeah, there's discontinuity, but it also kind of shows my progress as a composer. And I think it's fun to kind of, I don't know about you guys, but I think it's fun to listen to a kind of piece of music where you have that kind of progression. But it's also fun to listen to a music that's completely unified. So I guess there are cases to be made in both directions. But anyway, but then there's an example of like one possible way that I went about writing a larger scale formal piece of music. I came up with a little idea, and then a goalpost, and then the beginning, and then I just filled in the middle. And I didn't know how long it was going to take me to get there. But, you know, it's sort of like when you're looking at the mountain, right? It's sort of like, you know, you look at the mountain and you say, okay, I want to go to the mountain. But at the same time, you don't want to think I'm going to go in this path, because you don't know what path you're going to take until you travel up the mountain. And then you see a river and you go over the river, and then you realize you have to take a detour in a cave. So you're discovering the path as you go. You shouldn't micromanage the path. But at the same time, you want to know that you're going to the top of the mountain, because if you're just wandering around, then you're not going to get anywhere, and you're just going to go in circles, and there's not going to be any sense of unity. So balancing those two things, I think, are very, 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 very important. Zach, sorry for the self-promo, guys. I just thought it'd be the best place to get feedback. Oh, Zach, we've got a channel on Discord where you can post your music to get feedback, and it's pretty active. There are a lot of fantastic people on there who are commonly giving feedback, and I also give feedback there occasionally, and I'm going to give feedback more and more often as I have more time, especially once I finish the book. So join the Discord server, Zach, and you can post any, your music there and get feedback. Hi, I am 15. I'm a young composer and conductor. What would be your best advice to write pieces of music in the style of John Williams? Also a big fan of yours. Oh, thanks. Watch my videos if I can shamelessly plug. Watch my videos on how to write like John Williams. Get some Hal Leonard scores. There's concert suite versions of the music, but it's just as helpful because they're suites arranged by John Williams. They're a little expensive, so I know that's hard. It took me a while to save up for them. They're like $80 a piece. So when I first saved up enough money to get Adventures on Earth, it was like Christmas. Just pure candy. But yeah. So listen to all of his catalog, watch all of his interviews. He has a bunch of behind the scenes where he talks about the kind of more narrative, dramatic aspects. It's basically John Williams scoring Indiana Jones, John Williams scoring, E.T. There's also a great interview of him with Andre Previn where he kind of talks about the context of his life, which is really great, kind of a hidden gem. But yeah, score study, listen to his music, watch all of his interviews, practice writing music in his style, and then practice incorporating aspects of his style into your own style if that's what you're interested in doing. And also film score analysis has lots of fantastic reductions of his music. I would highly recommend checking out that YouTube channel. I'm getting a little hungry, so I think I'll probably stop at 5. But let me go through. I'm going to read all the questions and pick my favorite ones for the last one, unfortunately. In other words, Ben Shapiro. I do talk very quickly like my boy Ben Shapiro. What's up, my friends? This was an interesting tangent. Hello. Are there melodic fragments that denote a certain emotion for you? That is a fascinating question. I might answer that one because that's fascinating. That might take a little while, but we'll put that on the back burner for now. But that's a very interesting question. There's certain melodic fragments that denote a certain emotion for you. NBC Nightly News theme is great. Yeah, it's the news. There's some joke that some dude made where he was like, the NBC Nightly News theme, it's like E.T. is riding on a horse, with Indiana Jones, to a spaceship, basically making the joke that it sounds like, all of his other film music. But I think I don't think he meant it as pejoratively. I love the NBC Nightly News theme. I think it's fantastic melody and form. I'm actually not a huge fan of a lot of John Williams endings. I know I always praise John Williams all the time, but he has some great endings, but sometimes he kind of overdoes them a little bit, in my own personal subjective opinion. So in my own personal subjective opinion, I just imagine putting that into Grammarly and they're just like, all of these words are redundant, in my opinion. I've actually never heard of Maslanka. I'll have to check him out. Are you sometimes worried, afraid that you wrote a melody or piece that already exists and you subconsciously copied? No, and I'm going to be a little bit fatalist as far as this is concerned. I'm going to try and be honest and accurate, not in the interest of praising myself or anything, because it sometimes can be a bad thing. But I have a very, very, very good memory. I didn't even realize that this was the case until I kind of noticed other people, and I'm sure everyone can develop this. And I have a terrible memory when it comes to a lot of other things like names and all, but for whatever reason, I've always had a very good memory when it comes to melodies. And so whenever I write a melody, it's very rare that I've heard a piece of music. Like anytime I write something that sounds derivative, I usually know that it sounds derivative. I usually know exactly what it's from. And so I can avoid that. If you don't have that kind of memory, it may be a better idea. I think part of the reason why that is because I've studied other melodies very closely. Like I don't just listen to melody. Anytime I find a melody, whether it's from Shovel Knight or a Beatles song or anything, I will transcribe it out, study it, do an analysis of it. And if you do that, you'll never forget the melody, right? And so if you learn as many melodies as possible and actually transcribe and learn them, it cements them in your memory more to the degree that you're more likely to be able to not only recognize when you write something that sounds derivative, but exactly where the derivation comes from and then how to make the adjustment. The other thing is a lot of this goes into originality, right? So I would recommend you check out the third. Is it the third? I think it's the third. No, the third is catchiness. I can't remember. One of the One of the videos in my melody series is on originality. So I would recommend that you watch that video because I talk specifically about how to kind of techniques for being original in that case. Whoever asked the question about the melody, if I ever have a live stream again, ask that question again, or I'll try and remember because that's a very interesting melody. But I just know that that's going to put me on a 20-minute tangent. My stomach is grumbling. Let me continue. So at very least I want to read the rest of these. How do I get the incomplete version? Oh, anyone who doesn't have the incomplete version of my book and who has purchased it, you can just send me an email and I'll immediately send it to you. If you want to pre-order it and then you'll immediately get the incomplete version and you'll also get the finalized version. You can essentially just PayPal me $20. Unfortunately, I took it off of my Sellfly accounts because of the confusion and things like that. I may make another post if so. But if you really are that interested in the book that you want to read the incomplete version, I mean, there's a lot. It's almost 200 pages, even just the incomplete version. So if you want to pre-order it and immediately get the incomplete version and then also get the final version as soon as it's released, essentially just send me an email telling me that you PayPal me $20, and then I'll just send you the file immediately and I'll put you on the list and make sure that you get it finally. Ben Shapiro, but not evil. Ben Shapiro's not evil. I disagree with like the vast majority of stuff that he says, but he's definitely not evil. I write pretty fast and without a lot of planning. Is that a bad thing? I get really anxious about it. I mean, it depends upon the result and whether or not you have fun. Like for example, sometimes I will meticulously, every little teeny tiny and like the scherzo, for example, of my symphony, right? I just like I was just like, you know what? I'm gonna write I basically just thought Majora's literally what I did was I'm sure you all know that melody, which is kind of retrograde, right? That Lydian thing. Anyway, so I thought, okay, how can I use that motive because I like it so much in a non-derivative way, and so I kind of made it into a dotted rhythm thing. And then a B section. Wrong, it doesn't really matter. I wrote it, I can do whatever I want. But no, but anyway, so that started out as a direct derivation from Kondo, and then I just thought, okay, this scherzo, the whole scherzo is gonna be based on that motive, and then I didn't think it would play on anything. I just wrote it left to right, and maybe it turned out bad or wrong. I'll let you all decide for that. And then there are other pieces of music where I've specifically, so I just think that like, if you meticulously plan something in a healthy way, then the piece of music is going to end up sounding meticulously planned, and that has a certain kind of aesthetic appeal. But if you write something stream of consciousness and you do it in a healthy way, that also has a kind of organicism to it that has a different kind of aesthetic appeal. So I really don't think that one is better than the other. And I write music, I don't follow a process. I use a different process for like every piece of music I compose. Sometimes to me, it's almost like I feel like I'm collecting workflows. Everyone's like, it's sort of like the first thing is like, what's the objectively right workflow? And then everyone gets woke and is like, okay, what's the right workflow for me? And then I feel like the third level of wokeness is like, can I collect different workflows and know how to write in all of them so that because they produce different surface structures, and in the event that I want this surface structure, I can use one workflow. Because I mean, think about it. Even just writing a fugue involves a certain kind of workflow that's different from perhaps writing like a figuration prelude following a kind of compositional, following a harmonic structure or something like that. And obviously, I'm talking about the compositional aspect of the workflow, not the technical of like what specific keyboard shortcuts and things that you're using as far as that is concerned. But anyway, yeah, so I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but I do think that the fact that you're getting anxious about it is a bad thing. So don't be anxious. Easier said than done, but meditate, slow breathe. I'm exactly the same way. Do whatever works for you. Don't change the way. Yeah, I agree with Forrest. What suggestions would you have to develop? Also, how should I spend my things to make it run regular? Try to definitely evil F major. Are you familiar with the Debussy? Oh, he's definitely said evil things. Certainly, I agree. Absolutely, most definitely. But I don't think that he's an evil person. But that's a story for another time. No politics on my channel, okay? No politics, ever. Only music. Are you familiar with Debussy's orchestrations of Marie's Constant who wrote Twilight Zone? No! I would definitely be interested in that. But anyway, okay. That's kind of a low note to end it on. But you know what? I'll play a short little improvisation to end us out. And Oh, I didn't tell the whole story of. Okay, I'll have to have another video soon where I'll tell in detail the whole story, or maybe I'll write a blog post or something of what happened with the book and everything, a kind of more detailed story. So sorry about that, but anyway, it has been 2 hours. I have enjoyed this so much. Thank you all for showing up. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for your fantastic, really interesting questions, and I hope to have another one soon. And I'll be finishing the book soon, and I'll be making new YouTube videos, and I've got all kinds of fun projects in the work and things. So thank you all for being so patient and supportive, and I really, really appreciate it. But anyway, so I'll leave you with another little improvisation. Why don't you give me some ideas for improvisation as a last kind of final thing? It could be a chord, it could be a note, it could be a style, it could be anything. Something not too constraining. Locrian. Okay. What I did with that? I only stopped because I am so hungry. Anyway, but so there you go. I cheated and did a little bit of Lydia in there, but anyway, for those of you who are wondering, I was mostly B Locrian and like A flat Lydia with some other BS in between. Anyway, but I should do more improvisation too. I would honestly love to do that. Would you guys be interested in that? I always feel like it's gratuitous to do improvisation, but I enjoy improvising, and you guys seem like you enjoy it. So I'd enjoy doing more live streams where I improvise based on ideas that you give me. Maybe I can make a Twitch account and do, who knows. But anyway, so in any case, thank you all for joining. I hope you all have a fantastic week. And as always, thank you for all the love and support. Thank you for the subscriptions. And I cannot wait to see you in the next video. And I can't wait to get the final version of 21st Century Part Writing in all of your hands. So have a fantastic day. Have a great time making music. I'm going to go eat. And I will see you all later.